process and alter the band's conventional instruments, and his job title was upgraded to sound manipulator. Over time, these techniques would be key in making Roxy Music such a unique outfit.
I think from today's perspective, it's actually quite difficult to understand the sheer weirdness that was processing other instruments. Even the idea of treatments, which it later became called, and process, these were alien terms. And in initial Roxy Music shows, Brian wasn't even on stage. He was at the back of the hall at the mixing desk with his tape recorders and delay units, etc., feeding the guitar, the saxophone, sometimes the Brian Ferry's keyboard, sometimes even the vocal, through these tape recorders to create two signals. So you got the signal of the actual instrument, but then you also had the affected signal. And he would then mix at the mixing desk between these two, so that you could turn you know, an ordinary-ish guitar chord into something very, very strange, something that reverberated and repeated, and had a completely different character. So much so that some of the, like Phil Manzanera and Andy Mackay, rather ruefully noted that sometimes they'd hit a chord or a note and they wouldn't hear it back for some 10 seconds or something because it had been taking so long to go through Brian's various systems. It's taking what is essentially an orthodox rock band, however artfully clothed and shaped, Roxy Music, and giving it this patina of otherworldliness. And I think you know, he probably hasn't, even today, hasn't received enough credit for that.
Eno also became proficient on Andy Mackay's rare VCS-3 synthesizer, and not only would his experimental input become a dominant element in their recorded work, but by 1972, when the band were performing their first major live concerts, he had managed to become an essential part of their stage show.
He wasn't going to be the general keyboard player, which a bit like Brian was sitting there at the piano playing. He wasn't going to be like that. He was going to be in his own little box, as part of what was going, part of the group, but doing something completely different. And he developed this idea where he was like a controller at an airport with all the controls around him, and they would sit him at the, well, he sat himself at the mixer in front of the group, so people would be looking at the group and see this guy at the mixer playing along with the synthesizer, which was extraordinary. They'd never seen anything like that, because usually people at mixers were people who you didn't really look at them. They're just dressed in black and they're from the Alps.
Here's a guy, he's not, you know, a virtuoso musician, but he's got something and he's able to do something.
For the record-buying public, however, this something was both alien and mysterious. Upon the release of Roxy Music's debut in June 1972, the sonic experience of the album was so novel that many could not discern exactly what instruments they were listening to, and how much of this was due to the contribution of Eno.
From the opening of Remake Remodel, this was a sound that was obviously going to be very different. Determining Eno's role in it has never been easy. Consistently in Roxy Music, and perhaps even at later stages, you know, Eno often gets credited for things he didn't actually do, by his own admission. Anything that was sonically odd or different, any particular effect on any of those albums, the man you look at instantly was Eno. The beauty of it was that you never quite knew. There was a certain mysterious quality about Eno. It's precisely what he did and where he did it.
Eno's presence on the first Roxy album is perhaps not as palpable as it would have been on stage at that time. I mean, I think it's there. It's sort of background and it's kind of subtle, and it's like on Ladytron there's perhaps more of it, where I think Ferry famously asked him to create some lunar quality music, and Brian said, "Oh, I have just the thing," you know, he'd already made something. And that's quite high in the mix. And there are a few treatments of oboes and guitars throughout the album, where his presence is palpable, obviously, and it's wobbly and weird, and you know that, you know, when it's wobbly and weird, Brian Eno is nearby.
Yet the fact that Eno represented a new kind of musician posed a problem in some quarters of the rock fraternity. As the band's profile grew, in interview, Eno was more than happy to admit that he wasn't a classically trained virtuoso, and instead began to label himself a non-musician. This term was incredibly self-effacing, but the notion that a blooming figure in popular music was advocating invention over ability was both baffling and threatening to some.
Probably the most sort of heretical idea that had in the early 70s was this idea that he wasn't a musician. You didn't need to toil away in your room learning all these techniques, and there was a kind of a sort of joyous, gleeful contempt for craft, which was really a radical break with the 60s. There was a lot of people who went to art school. Eric Clapton went to art school, but they all had subscribed to this idea of learning your instrument and practicing and virtuosity. But what Eno introduced from the sort of radical art school environment was this idea that you could be an artist, but you didn't necessarily have to have skill.
Here's this guy who plays synthesizer and Roxy music, but he doesn't so much play it as he plays with it. He uses it as an effect. He uses it as a stage prop. It was all very visual. What he was wearing on stage with Roxy music was outrageous, even by the standards of the time. And that was the whole point, to attract a lot of attention with this big kind of, as he put it, like a shake you by the lapels kind of musical statement. But again, he wasn't a musician. He didn't practice. He didn't have a lot of chops. As far as I know, he still doesn't today. If you look at Keith Emerson or Rick Wakeman, these guys have chops up the wazoo. They are classically trained musicians that can play anything.
If you compare him to the Rick Wakemans of this world, or the Keith Emersons of this world, who were the predominant keyboardists in progressive rock at the time, these were music school guys, essentially. They could play with their eyes closed. Eno needed to have dots on the keyboard to actually even make anything. So you had the non-musician versus the musician, and it was understandable there was certain suspicion and prejudice against Eno because he wasn't a player, and they were. He wasn't interested in virtuosity or playing or technical ability. The musicians used music to make music. For Eno, music was a function of art. It was the function of something else. It wasn't just music for music's sake. And inevitably, that's going to create jealousy from somebody who's been playing an instrument 15 hours a day since they were 10 years old, to see somebody come along from an art school and just tinker with the thing as if it was nothing more than a plaything, and also to be given greater critical kudos as a result. It must be very frustrating.
And although Eno's status as a non-musician may have antagonized some of the old guard, as he persisted with the VCS3 synth, he grew accomplished in using what was a complex machine. The music press became intrigued by his technical activities, which he would discuss enthusiastically in interviews, and a picture began forming of Eno as the mad professor of rock, a new kind of musician mastering emerging technology.
At the time, the only other people that used the VCS3 were Pink Floyd, who had one in the studio because they were recording Dark Side of the Moon at the time, and they were starting to experiment with this thing. And the other people who had this were, Germans like Klaus Schulze. Eno was the most interested in using it all the time. The others only wanted to use